Picture this. A 13-year-old boy drops out of school to work in a department store, supporting his struggling family while his father battles alcoholism. Fast forward 30 years, and that same boy becomes the man who builds a massive cargo ship in less than 5 days, shocking the entire world and changing the course of World War II forever. This is the absolutely incredible story of Henry Kaiser, the farm boy turned industrial genius who took on impossible odds and revolutionized an entire industry when America needed it most. What I'm about to tell you sounds like pure fiction, but every single detail is documented history. A man with zero shipbuilding experience walked into the most traditional industry in America and completely turned it upside down. While seasoned shipbuilders were taking 6 months to complete one vessel, Kaiser figured out how to finish the same job in just 2 weeks. And when people said he was crazy when they called his methods reckless, he proved them all wrong by building the fastest ship in human history. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Kaiser didn't just build ships faster, he completely reimagined how things could be made, creating techniques that are still used today. He hired women and minorities when nobody else would. He invented the first major health insurance system in America, and he did all of this while fighting a war on 2 fronts, against both the Nazis and the American establishment that wanted to stop him. The man who would become America's greatest wartime industrialist was born Heinrich John Kaiser on May 9th, 1882, in the tiny farming community of Sprout Brook, New York. His parents, Frank and Mary Kaiser, were German immigrants who had arrived in America with nothing but hope and determination. Frank had been a skilled shoemaker back in Germany, but in America he struggled to find steady work and began drinking heavily. The family was poor, desperately poor, and 13-year-old Henry watched his father's alcoholism tear their household apart. When most kids his age were worried about schoolwork and playing with friends, Henry was carrying the weight of his entire family on his shoulders. He made the heartbreaking decision to leave school and take a job as a cash boy in a department store in Utica, New York. Every penny he earned went straight to his mother to help feed his 3 older sisters and keep a roof over their heads. This wasn't temporary help. This was survival. But something extraordinary happened during those brutal early years. Instead of being crushed by the responsibility, Henry thrived under pressure. He discovered he had an incredible work ethic that bordered on obsession. While other employees worked 8-hour days, Henry regularly pulled 12 to 15-hour shifts. He wasn't just working harder than everyone else, he was studying every aspect of the business, learning how things worked, figuring out how they could work better. By age 20, Henry had taught himself photography and was running his own studio in Lake Placid. He was finally making decent money, finally able to support his family properly. But then fate intervened in the most unexpected way. The girl he wanted to marry had a father who looked at Henry's modest photography income and basically said, "Not good enough. If you want to marry my daughter, you need to make more money." Most people would have been devastated by this rejection. Henry Kaiser saw it as a challenge. He sold his photography business, packed his few belongings, and headed west with a burning determination to prove that father wrong. He bounced from city to city, job to job, always learning, always pushing himself harder. In Spokane, Washington, he became the top salesman at a hardware company. But selling wasn't enough for Henry. He wanted to build things. In 1906, Henry took every dollar he had saved and started his own construction company. This wasn't just another small business venture. This was the beginning of something that would change American industry forever. Henry's company specialized in government contracts, and from the very first project, people noticed something different about how he operated. His crews worked faster than anyone else. His projects came in under budget and ahead of schedule. And Henry himself was on site every single day, working alongside his men, solving problems in real time. But it was in 1914 that Henry Kaiser's true genius really began to show. He was working on a road construction project when the company he was employed by suddenly went bankrupt. The project was half finished, workers were unpaid, and the government was threatening to cancel the entire contract. Most people would have walked away from such a disaster. Henry saw opportunity. He took over the entire project himself, founding the Henry J. Kaiser Company. But here's what made him different from every other contractor in America. Henry was one of the first builders to embrace heavy construction machinery. While his competitors were still doing most work by hand, Henry was investing in massive steam shovels, bulldozers, and other equipment that could move earth faster than armies of workers with shovels. The gamble paid off spectacularly. His company grew rapidly, and by 1927, Henry landed the contract that would make him famous across the construction industry. The Cuban government wanted someone to build 200 miles of roads and 500 bridges as part of their Central Highway project. The job was massive. The timeline was aggressive and the conditions were brutal. Henry took it without hesitation. What happened in Cuba changed everything Henry thought he knew about construction and management. His expensive American machinery kept breaking down in the tropical heat and humidity. Repairs took weeks. Costs were spiraling out of control and the project seemed doomed to failure. But instead of panicking, Henry made a decision that revealed his true character. He put his Cuban workers in charge. While the machines were being repaired, Henry watched in amazement as his Cuban crew accomplished more with hand tools and teamwork than his sophisticated equipment had managed. They weren't just working faster, they were working smarter, finding solutions to problems that his engineers had missed. Henry realized that the real power in any project wasn't the machinery, it was the people operating it. The Cuban project finished 3 years ahead of schedule and came in significantly under budget. Henry returned to America with a completely new philosophy about construction and management. He had learned that with the right leadership, the right motivation, and the right organization, ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. This lesson would prove absolutely crucial when he later faced the impossible challenge of building ships faster than anyone thought possible. But first, Henry had to prove himself on an even bigger stage. In 1931, his company became one of the prime contractors for the most ambitious construction project in American history, the Hoover Dam. This wasn't just another building contract. This was an engineering challenge that pushed the absolute limits of what was considered possible. A concrete dam 726 feet high holding back the entire Colorado River, built in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Henry's role in the Hoover Dam project showcased every skill he had developed over the previous 25 years. His crews worked in temperatures that regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. They poured concrete 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They moved more earth and stone than had ever been moved in a single project. And they finished the entire massive undertaking 2 years ahead of schedule. The success of the Hoover Dam made Henry Kaiser one of the most respected construction executives in America. He followed up by helping build the Bonneville Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam, establishing himself as the go-to contractor for massive government infrastructure projects. His reputation was built on 3 simple principles that he never compromised on. Work harder than anyone else, find better ways to do everything, and never, ever accept that something is impossible. By 1940, Henry Kaiser was wealthy, successful, and respected. He could have easily spent the rest of his life building dams and roads, enjoying the fruits of 30 years of relentless hard work. But as Europe exploded into war and German submarines began sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced, Henry saw a different kind of opportunity. An opportunity to use everything he had learned about mass production, workforce management, and innovative construction techniques to solve a problem that was threatening to lose the war before America even entered it. The British were desperately short of cargo ships. German U-boats were sending Allied vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic at a terrifying rate. Every sunken ship meant lost supplies, lost equipment, and too often, lost lives. American shipyards on the East Coast assured government officials that they could meet any demand. But they were slow to expand production and seemed more interested in protecting their traditional methods than in solving an urgent crisis. Henry Kaiser looked at the shipbuilding industry and saw exactly what he had seen in construction 30 years earlier. An old-fashioned business that was ripe for revolution. Traditional shipbuilders took 6 to 8 months to complete a single vessel, using techniques that hadn't changed significantly since the Civil War. They riveted steel plates together by hand, assembled ships piece by piece in a process that required highly skilled craftsmen and enormous amounts of time. But Henry didn't see ships as floating works of art that required months of careful craftsmanship. He saw them as products that could be mass-produced using the same principles that Henry Ford had used to revolutionize automobile manufacturing. If cars could be built on assembly lines using interchangeable parts and unskilled workers, why couldn't ships be built the same way? In December 1940, Henry formed a partnership with Todd Shipyards to produce 30 ships for the British at a brand new facility in Richmond, California. The plan seemed straightforward. Henry would build the shipyard while Todd would handle the actual ship construction. But within months it became clear that Todd Shipyards wasn't prepared to work at the pace Henry demanded. They wanted to stick with traditional methods, traditional timelines, and traditional results. Henry Kaiser had not spent 30 years revolutionizing the construction industry just to let someone else slow him down when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Within a year, Todd was out and Henry was running the entire operation himself. He had never built a ship in his life, had no experience with marine engineering, and was jumping into the most conservative industry in America. Every expert said he would fail spectacularly. They were about to discover just how wrong they could be. Henry Kaiser's first challenge wasn't technical engineering or maritime design. It was convincing people that his crazy ideas might actually work. When he announced his plans to build ships using assembly line methods, the reaction from established shipbuilders ranged from polite skepticism to outright ridicule. These were men who had spent decades perfecting their crafts, whose fathers and grandfathers had built ships the same way for generations. And here was this damn builder from California claiming he could do their job better and faster than they ever imagined possible. But Henry had something his critics didn't. He had spent years studying how things could be improved, and he had an absolute genius for seeing solutions that others missed. During a visit to a Ford automobile plant, one of his associates had an epiphany that would change everything. They watched cars being assembled from pre-manufactured parts, with each worker specializing in one specific task, and suddenly the answer became crystal clear. Ships didn't have to be built like medieval cathedrals, crafted slowly by master artisans. They could be manufactured like cars using standardized components and efficient production techniques. The breakthrough came when Henry decided to abandon riveting in favor of welding. This might sound like a minor technical detail, but it was actually revolutionary. Traditional shipbuilding required skilled riveters to hammer thousands of metal pins through overlapping steel plates, a process that was slow, expensive, and required years of training to master. Welding, on the other hand, could be learned by almost anyone in just a few weeks. Better yet, welded joints were actually stronger than riveted ones, and they used less steel because the plates didn't need to overlap. Henry's critics immediately pounced on this decision. Welding was relatively new technology, they argued. It hadn't been proven in large-scale shipbuilding. What if the welds failed in heavy seas? What if the ships broke apart under stress? These weren't unreasonable concerns, but Henry had done his homework. He knew that welding could work, and more importantly, he knew it had to work if America was going to build ships fast enough to win the war. The first challenge was finding workers. Traditional shipbuilding required highly trained craftsmen who had served long apprenticeships, but there simply weren't enough skilled shipbuilders in America to meet wartime demand. Henry's solution was typically radical. He would train his own workforce from scratch, taking people who had never seen a ship before and teaching them to build the most sophisticated vessels in the world. His recruitment campaign was unlike anything the shipbuilding industry had ever seen. Henry sent recruiters across the entire United States looking for anyone willing to work hard and learn fast. They hired farmers from the Midwest who had never seen an ocean. They hired factory workers from Detroit who understood machinery but knew nothing about ships. Most controversially, they hired women and minorities, groups that had been almost completely excluded from shipbuilding jobs. The established shipbuilding companies were horrified. How could you possibly build quality ships with inexperienced workers? How could women handle the physical demands of heavy construction? How could people with no maritime background understand the complexities of ship design? Henry's answer was simple. You taught them one job at a time, you gave them the right tools, and you organized the work so that individual expertise mattered less than collective efficiency. The pre-war population of Richmond, California had been about 20,000 people. As construction of Henry's shipyard began, that number exploded to over 120,000 almost overnight. Workers poured in from every corner of America, creating a boomtown atmosphere that was part gold rush, part military mobilization. Housing was desperately scarce, schools were overcrowded, and the entire infrastructure of the region was stretched to its breaking point. Henry's response was characteristically bold. If Richmond couldn't house his workers, he would build new cities from scratch. He constructed Vanport on the northern edge of Portland, a planned community with nearly 10,000 housing units that could accommodate over 40,000 residents. It was one of the largest housing developments ever built in such a short time, complete with schools, shopping centres, and recreational facilities. But the real innovation was happening inside the shipyards themselves. Henry had completely reimagined how ships could be constructed. Instead of building vessels from the bottom up, piece by piece, his yards would construct entire sections simultaneously in different parts of the facility. Massive prefabricated components like bulkheads, deck houses, and bow sections would be built separately, then moved into position using enormous cranes and welded together. This modular approach meant that work could proceed on multiple parts of the ship at the same time. While one team was working on the engine room, another could be assembling the bridge, and a third could be preparing cargo holds. The efficiency gains were staggering. What had traditionally been a sequential process where each step had to be completed before the next could begin became a parallel operation where dozens of tasks happened simultaneously. The ships Henry was building weren't elegant or beautiful in the traditional sense. These were Liberty ships, utilitarian cargo vessels designed for one purpose: getting supplies across dangerous oceans as quickly and cheaply as possible. They were 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, and could carry over 9,000 tons of cargo. Their 5 massive holds could accommodate everything from ammunition and food to tanks and locomotives, with additional equipment secured to the deck. Each Liberty ship required nearly 50 miles of welding and more than 30,000 individual components manufactured in factories across the United States. The scale of coordination required was mind-boggling. Henry had to synchronize the delivery of parts from hundreds of suppliers, schedule the work of thousands of employees, and maintain quality control across every aspect of production. And he had to do it all while learning the shipbuilding business from scratch. The first Liberty ship was completed in September 1941, and it had taken 197 days to build. For a first attempt by someone with no shipbuilding experience, this was actually impressive. But Henry wasn't satisfied. 197 days was still too slow if America was going to build ships faster than German submarines could sink them. He needed to find ways to cut that time dramatically. Over the following months, Henry and his teams obsessively analysed every aspect of their production process. They timed individual tasks, studied workflow patterns, and identified bottlenecks that were slowing down overall progress. They experimented with different sequences of assembly, tested new welding techniques, and constantly refined their methods based on what they learned from each completed ship. The improvements came rapidly. The second ship took 150 days. The fifth took 120. By the spring of 1942, Henry's yards were completing Liberty ships in under 60 days, a pace that amazed even his own workers. But he still wasn't satisfied. If American forces were going to launch successful offensives in both the Pacific and Atlantic theatres, they would need ships even faster than that. The breakthrough came when Henry realised that his modular construction methods could be pushed much further than anyone had imagined. Instead of just building major components separately, his teams could pre-assemble entire sections of the ship's hull. Complete deck sections, stern assemblies, and bow units could be manufactured as finished products, then brought together for final assembly. This approach required unprecedented precision in manufacturing and coordination. Every component had to be built to exact specifications so that parts manufactured in different areas of the yard would fit together perfectly. The welding had to be flawless because any weak joints could cause catastrophic failures. The scheduling had to be precise because delays in any one section would hold up the entire ship. But when it worked, the results were spectacular. By the summer of 1942, Henry's shipyards were completing Liberty ships in an average of 50 days. Other shipyards across America, many now using techniques pioneered at Richmond, were achieving similar speeds. American ship production was finally beginning to match the pace of German submarine attacks. Then Henry decided to find out just how fast a Liberty ship could actually be built. He announced that his Richmond yard would attempt to break all existing speed records by constructing a complete vessel in less than 10 days. Critics called it a publicity stunt, a reckless gamble that would result in a shoddily built ship that might break apart at sea. Henry called it an incentive project, a way to boost worker morale and prove that American industrial capacity was limitless. The ship chosen for this record attempt would be named the SS Robert E. Peary, after the famous Arctic explorer. Construction would begin at exactly midnight on November 8, 1942, and Henry promised that the completed vessel would be launched within 10 days. Every major newspaper and newsreel company sent reporters to cover the attempt. The eyes of the world would be watching to see if Henry Kaiser's revolutionary methods could achieve something that seemed physically impossible. What happened next would make Henry Kaiser a household name across America and send shockwaves through both Allied and Axis military leadership. The construction of the Robert E. Peary would prove that American industrial might was capable of achievements that defied every assumption about what was possible in wartime production. At exactly 12:01 a.m. on November 8, 1942, the keel of the SS Robert E. Peary was laid down at Kaiser's Richmond shipyard. What followed was the most intense display of coordinated industrial effort ever witnessed in American history. This wasn't just about building a ship quickly. This was about proving that American workers could accomplish miracles when properly organized and motivated. The yard had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Every component needed for the Robert E. Peary had been pre-manufactured and staged in precise locations around the facility. More than 250,000 individual parts, weighing a combined 14 million pounds, were ready for assembly. The logistics alone were staggering. Henry had coordinated the work of thousands of employees across multiple shifts, with each person knowing exactly what their role would be and when they would need to perform it. But this wasn't just about having the right parts in the right places. Henry had fundamentally reimagined the entire construction process. Instead of building the ship from bottom to top in traditional fashion, his teams would work on dozens of sections simultaneously. While one crew assembled the engine room, another would be completing the bridge superstructure. While welders joined hull plates, electricians would be installing wiring systems in prefabricated compartments. The pace was absolutely relentless. Work continued around the clock with 3 full shifts of workers. Massive cranes moved constantly overhead, lifting completed sections into position. The sound of welding torches, hammering, and heavy machinery never stopped. Reporters who came to cover the record attempt described a scene that looked more like controlled chaos than organized construction. Henry himself was everywhere during those 4 days. Workers would see him inspecting welds at 3 in the morning, discussing technical problems with engineers at dawn, and motivating crews during shift changes. He had an incredible ability to spot potential problems before they became serious delays, and his presence seemed to energize everyone working on the project. This wasn't just their boss watching them work. This was a man who genuinely believed that together they could achieve something extraordinary. The welding work was particularly crucial. Each Liberty ship required nearly 50 miles of continuous welding, and every joint had to be perfect. A single, weak weld could cause a catastrophic failure that would sink the ship and kill its crew. Henry's welders, many of whom had learned their trade in just a few weeks, were performing work that would determine whether American supplies reached Allied forces fighting desperately across two theatres of war. What made this possible was Henry's revolutionary training system. Instead of requiring workers to master every aspect of shipbuilding, he had broken down the construction process into specialized tasks that could be learned quickly but performed expertly. A welder didn't need to understand naval architecture, but they needed to create perfect joints between steel plates. A crane operator didn't need to know about engine systems, but they needed to place heavy components with millimeter precision. By the end of the second day, the Robert E. Peary was beginning to look like an actual ship. The hull was taking shape, major bulkheads were in place, and the superstructure was rising above the deck. Reporters couldn't believe what they were seeing. Traditional shipbuilding wisdom said that quality construction required months of careful work. Here was a vessel being assembled in days, and it looked exactly like ships that had taken half a year to complete. The third day brought the most complex challenges. Engine installation required incredible precision, as the massive power plant had to be lowered into the hull and connected to dozens of systems throughout the ship. The propeller shaft had to be perfectly aligned, the boilers had to be properly secured, and hundreds of pipes and cables had to be routed through the vessel. Any mistake at this stage could delay completion by days or even weeks. But Henry's modular approach proved its worth once again. The engine room had been largely pre-assembled as a complete unit, with all major components already connected and tested. Instead of installing individual pieces of machinery, his crews were essentially dropping a finished engine room into the ship's hull. The time savings were enormous, but more importantly, the quality was actually higher than traditional methods because everything had been assembled and tested under controlled conditions. As the fourth day progressed, excitement throughout the shipyard reached fever pitch. Workers who weren't directly involved in the Robert E. Peary construction would stop by during breaks to watch the progress. Local radio stations provided regular updates. Newspapers across the country were preparing headlines about what seemed certain to be a new world record. But Henry wasn't satisfied with just breaking the existing 10-day record. He wanted to shatter it completely to prove that American industrial capacity was limited only by imagination and determination. As the final hours approached, his teams pushed even harder. Welders worked with surgical precision, crane operators moved with ballet-like grace, and supervisors coordinated activities with military efficiency. The final welding was completed at 3:30 a.m. on November 12th. Just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel had been laid, the SS Robert E. Peary was structurally complete. But Henry's achievement went beyond just speed. Every system had been tested, every component had been inspected, and the completed vessel met every specification required for active service. The launch ceremony was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Thousands of workers gathered around the ways as the Robert E. Peary slid into San Francisco Bay. Government officials, military leaders, and reporters from around the world watched in amazement as Henry Kaiser's impossible dream became reality. The ship that traditional methods would have required 6 months to complete had been built in less than a week. But the real test wasn't the construction time. It was whether this rapidly built vessel could actually perform its mission. Critics argued that speed had come at the expense of quality, that the Robert E. Peary would break apart under stress or develop critical failures at sea. Henry's reputation and the future of his revolutionary shipbuilding methods depended on how well his record-breaking ship performed in actual combat conditions. The Robert E. Peary's first voyage began on November 22, 1942, just 10 days after launch. Her crew included 17 naval armed guards and 43 merchant mariners, brave men who were entrusting their lives to a ship that had been built faster than anyone thought possible. Their destination was Noumea, New Caledonia, carrying desperately needed food and war supplies to Allied forces fighting in the Pacific. The voyage was successful, but it was just the beginning of what would become one of the most distinguished service records of any Liberty ship. The Robert E. Peary proved that Henry's revolutionary construction methods produced vessels that were not just fast to build, but genuinely effective in combat. She carried supplies across the Pacific, transported troops to invasion beaches, and even participated in combat rescue operations under enemy fire. During one particularly heroic mission, the Robert E. Peary saved American soldiers who were trapped on a Pacific Island beach while under Japanese attack. The ship maneuvered dangerously close to shore and used her deck gun to shoot a supply line to the trapped troops, providing them with ammunition and food until they could defeat the enemy forces. This wasn't the kind of mission that cautious commanders would assign to a ship they didn't trust completely. The success of the Robert E. Peary silenced most of Henry's critics, but it also created new challenges. Government officials and military leaders were now demanding that all American shipyards adopt Kaiser's methods. Traditional shipbuilders who had resisted change were suddenly forced to acknowledge that this outsider from California had revolutionized their entire industry. By 1943, American shipyards using Henry's techniques were launching 50 merchant vessels every single day. The production numbers were staggering. Over the course of the entire war, American yards would complete over 2,700 Liberty ships, with Henry's facilities responsible for more than half of that total. His shipbuilding empire had become the largest maritime construction operation in human history. But the statistics, impressive as they were, only told part of the story. Henry Kaiser had done something far more significant than just building ships quickly. He had proven that American industrial capacity, properly organized and motivated, was virtually limitless. He had shown that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when given the right tools, training, and leadership. And he had demonstrated that innovation and determination could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. The ripple effects of Henry's achievements extended far beyond shipbuilding. His hiring practices had opened industrial jobs to women and minorities on an unprecedented scale. His modular construction techniques influenced manufacturing across dozens of industries. His approach to worker training became a model for rapid skill development that is still used today, and his integration of healthcare benefits established principles that evolved into modern employee benefit systems. Perhaps most importantly, Henry Kaiser had changed how America thought about what was possible. Before the war, the United States had been seen as an industrial power, but not necessarily as the world's dominant manufacturing force. Henry's shipbuilding achievements, combined with similar innovations in aircraft production, tank manufacturing, and munitions, established America as the arsenal of democracy that could outproduce any combination of enemies. The construction of the Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes became a symbol of American determination and ingenuity. It proved that when the stakes were highest, when freedom itself hung in the balance, Americans could achieve miracles through hard work, innovation, and unwavering commitment to victory. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender, but Henry Kaiser's legacy was just beginning to take shape. The man who had entered shipbuilding as a complete outsider had fundamentally transformed not just maritime construction, but American industry itself. His achievements during those 4 years of war production read like something from a fantasy novel. Yet every number, every innovation, every breakthrough was documented reality. Between 1941 and 1945, Henry's shipyards had produced 1,490 vessels, representing 30% of all maritime construction ordered by the United States Maritime Commission. His facilities were completing ships in 2/3 the time and at 1/4 the cost of traditional shipyards. When all his yards were operating at peak capacity, they were launching one completed vessel every single day. No industrial operation in human history had ever achieved such sustained productivity. But the raw numbers only captured part of what Henry had accomplished. He had taken an industry that hadn't changed significantly since the age of sail and dragged it into the modern era of mass production. The techniques he pioneered during those desperate war years became standard practice worldwide. Modular construction, prefabricated assembly, and welded hulls became the foundation of modern shipbuilding. Maritime engineers still study his methods today, 70 years later. The human impact was equally revolutionary. Henry had hired over 200,000 people during the war, many of whom had never imagined they could work in heavy industry. Women who had been limited to traditional roles found themselves operating massive cranes and performing precision welding. African Americans who had been excluded from skilled trades discovered they could master complex technical work when given proper training and opportunity. Immigrants and rural workers who had never seen an ocean learned to build the most sophisticated vessels ever constructed. His worker housing projects had created entire communities from nothing. Vanport, the city he built for his Portland employees, had become the second largest city in Oregon almost overnight. These weren't temporary barracks or crew dormitories. Henry had constructed complete communities with schools, hospitals, shopping centres, and recreational facilities. He understood that productive workers needed more than just jobs. They needed stable homes, quality healthcare, and strong communities. The healthcare system Henry developed for his workers became his most enduring legacy. Kaiser Permanente, which began as a simple medical plan for shipyard employees, evolved into one of America's largest health maintenance organizations. Today, it serves over 12 million people and generates nearly $80 billion in annual revenue. The principles Henry established during those frantic war years, prepaid healthcare, group medical practice, and comprehensive wellness programs became the foundation for modern employee benefits across American industry. Today, Henry Kaiser Permanente serves millions of Americans, a living testament to one man's belief that taking care of workers wasn't just good business, it was the right thing to do. The Liberty ships he built in those desperate war years have long since been scrapped, but the techniques he pioneered still shape how we manufacture everything from automobiles to aircraft carriers. The story of Henry Kaiser proves something profound about human potential. It shows us that the most revolutionary breakthroughs often come from outsiders who refuse to accept that things must be done a certain way simply because they've always been done that way. Kaiser looked at an industry that claimed 6 months was the minimum time needed to build a ship, and he asked a simple question: why? That question, and his relentless pursuit of a better answer, changed everything. In 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, he didn't just build the fastest ship in history, he demonstrated that American ingenuity, properly organized and motivated, could accomplish absolutely anything. When freedom hung in the balance, when the fate of democracy depended on industrial capacity, ordinary Americans rose to meet an extraordinary challenge. The boy who dropped out of school at 13 to support his struggling family became the man who helped win the most important war in human history. Henry Kaiser's legacy reminds us that no dream is too ambitious, no timeline too aggressive, and no obstacle too insurmountable when we refuse to accept limitations others try to impose on us.